Yo friends, it's still winter here in the northeastern US, but spring is fast approaching. And I want to talk about what you can do right now to get ready for starting your own perennial forest garden or food forest this season. While there's not much you can do for vegetable gardening right now other than starting seeds inside, there's actually a lot you can and should do if you're interested in doing more perennial growing or even starting a small forest garden in your backyard this next year. So I want to talk about what you can do right now. There's two main things. The first is planning, and that's pretty broad, and then the second is prepping the ground. So in terms of planning, you're thinking about not only planning what plants you want to put in the ground, but you're also having to figure out where they go. And that's really important when you're growing perennials. A tomato you can move around year to year, a tree is stuck there for life. So let's talk for a minute about what kind of plants you might put in a forest garden and how the forest garden overall works, and then we'll talk about where you want to put those plants in the landscape. A food forest is not necessarily a forest of trees like this. Rather, food forest refers to the concept of growing food like a forest. So you're using a diversity of perennial trees and shrubs and plants working in tandem together to produce a lot of food. And one difference here in the vegetable garden and food forests, in a veggie garden, you're really focusing on maximizing the potential of an individual plant. You want this tomato to get a lot of tomatoes out of it. As opposed to a forest garden or a food forest where you want to maximize the productive potential of the garden as a whole. So in a food forest, there's different elements of that forest. You have the overstory, like your big nut trees, like a hickory or a chestnut. You have your understory trees, like an apple or a pear that aren't quite as tall and can handle a little bit of shade. You have your large shrubs, like an elderberry, and a smaller shrub, like a gooseberry. And then you also have your ground cover plants, maybe like mint and maybe strawberries. And then you have your tubers, your underground plants. Like in a garden, you might have like carrots or potatoes. In a food forest, you're thinking maybe sunchokes. And then you also have your vining plants, like grapevines that climb up everything, and you have your mushrooms to think about. So there's a number of elements all working together, and you want to think about how you can piece those together and which elements you want to use and which plants you want to use to fill each need. I really encourage you to start small. Think about one big overstory tree you want to use to start your food forest and then work out from there. So start at the top and work down in terms of like start with the big plants and work to the smaller plants, and then start in one area and work out. When we're talking about food forests, an important concept here that we talk about in permaculture is the use of guilds. And the idea here is a guild is a small series of plants, a small collection of plants focused around one main plant in the very center. A great example of this is actually what I started doing in my front yard in my old property. I only had a 10 by 10 area to plant in, so everything was focused around one main tree. I had a pear tree. Now it wasn't a big overstory nut tree, I didn't have space for that, and so a semi-dwarf pear tree was my kind of overstory tree. And then around that pear tree at the very edges to maximize light, I had some honeyberries, I had a tea shrub, I had some yastaberry bushes. And then inside that area were strawberries, was mint, I had nectar producing plants for the insects. So when you're thinking about a forest garden, don't try to plan the full half-acre property. Instead, start with one tree. And so I say you might want a big nut tree, and think about what trees you can put under that and what shrubs you can put under and immediately right around that. And when you have that kind of figured out and planned, then you can move next to that big nut tree and think about what's the next big nut tree or a persimmon tree, what's the next big overstory tree you want near that. This keeps everything way easier to kind of manage in your mind and way easier to plan out. You're doing it one section at a time, and also it can help you save a lot of money and help you work slowly. So instead of having to plan out a full half acre, maybe this summer you just start with one small guild. And then next year you build another guild next to it, and the following year you build a third guild, and eventually, next thing you know, you have a forest garden that covers half acre or an acre or a couple acres. All right, so what plants are we putting in here? Now, I've mentioned some of them already, and I'll kind of go through some more here. So your overstory plants, you're thinking tall trees widespreading. Now, some of you probably, like myself, won't be able to plant those just because of the size of your property, or you'll only be able to plant maybe 2. You oftentimes will need 2 for pollination purposes. So don't feel like you have to use this. Like I mentioned before, I used a pear tree as my kind of overstory tree. Now, everything I'm talking about here comes from my perspective of living in the Northeast United States. A lot of these trees are very specific to that area of the world. I'm in zone 6. And so you want to be aware of that and think about that maybe some of these plants just won't work for you. But you can still take these concepts as a whole, finding plants that grow in your area and produce food, and use these concepts to build your forest garden. So in that overstory category of big trees that produce a lot of food would be your like black walnuts, English walnuts, chestnuts, persimmon, hickories. These trees will produce a ton of food for a really long time, but they're also really slow to get going. So it's important to plant, I think it's important to plant other trees in and around that area, the smaller understory stuff and your shrubs. That way you can start getting some food pretty soon, within the next 2 or 3 years, as opposed to maybe 10 years. Next up after your overstory is your understory. We're talking apples, pears, hazelnuts, elderberry, peaches, cherry trees, pawpaws. These trees are typically grown in an open field orchard in full sun. They produce a lot more fruit that way, but these trees were really first evolved to be suited to the understory. They still want quite a bit of sun, but they are adapted to grow a fair bit of fruit in dappled shade. So these are trees that you might not put like directly underneath your big hickory tree, but you can put on the outside edges or just inside a little bit, especially on maybe the southern side, so they still get some of that south-facing sun. And again, this is about production of the whole unit. So an individual apple tree underneath a hickory may not produce as many apples as in a field, but the hickory and the apple together produce a lot more food in that same square footage than an apple tree on its own. The next layer is your shrubs. In a food forest in this area, I really love like yastaberries and currants and gooseberries. They're all kind of in the same family. Elderberries are really great for this too. Honeyberry is a Japanese native berry that's very similar to a blueberry. You can also do blueberries. You could do cranberries. You can do goji berries and gumi berries. If you haven't heard of some of these plants before, it's okay. A lot of these, again, are plants you can't really find in stores. You kind of have to grow them yourself in your backyard or get them from someone who grows them near you. They are, however, really delicious. Gumi berries are a berry I tried for the first time this past year, and they quickly became, I think, my new favorite berry. They tasted like eating gummy bears. Underneath the shrubs, you're planting your ground cover. This ground cover is really important because you can mulch your forest garden area really heavily with like wood chips, but you don't want to put those wood chips in every year. And so you want plants to take that role of shading the ground and retaining moisture, and by covering the ground, they also prevent weeds from popping through. So we're thinking strawberries, mint, comfrey, yarrow. There's like low bush cranberries and blueberries that can cover the ground really well. And you can use bulbing plants like onions and garlic. You can use comfrey and horseradish, which really spread out their leaves, and bloody dock. You can use these maybe around the outer edges of your small guild to prevent grass from creeping in. Your vining plants are next, grapes and hardy kiwi. You could do ground nuts. And then especially if you already have wood chips mulched in your forest garden, mushrooms are a fantastic thing to add. I love wine cap mushrooms. They grow well in the shade, and they're one of my favorite tasting mushrooms. So with these plants, you want to think about how they interact together. You have your overstory, kind of casting some shade, some understory plants which live in that shade, your vining plants crawling up these, you have your ground cover plants which work to, like I said, shade the ground, retain moisture. You also want to think about having fertilizing plants. So plants like your tree is going to drop leaves, those leaves are going to compost, that's important. Your comfrey is a plant with a deep taproot, and people have found that that deep taproot can help bring up nutrients that are deeper in the soil and harder for some of your shallow rooted plants to really access. You also can have nitrogen fixing plants like your gumi berry or your ground nuts. These are plants that oftentimes are in the pea family, and when you trim them, when you prune them, their roots die back slightly, releasing nitrogen into the ground for your other plants around them to feed on. So your first homework project, if you want to start this forest garden this summer, is to really research what types of plants you want to grow. And I would say start small. In my front yard and my old property, I had about 30 different types of plants growing in this 10 by 10 foot area, but you don't have to start there. Even starting with 3 or 4 different types of plants is great. I would say start with your main tree that you want, and then figure out 1 or 2 different types of ground cover, and maybe 1 or 2 different types of shrubs on the edges underneath that main tree. A lot of these plants actually can be transplanted and bought this time of year. You don't really want to put your tomatoes in the ground right now, but if you buy a hazelnut tree, I have some hazelnut trees for sale on my nursery, and I'm selling them now bare root. And so with their leaves falling off them, they're in dormancy for the winter, and they transport really well, and they be transplanted in the ground really easily without disturbing the tree very much. It doesn't even realize sometimes that it's been picked up and moved. It'll just grow like it hasn't been moved at all. So if your ground is thawed, this is a really good time to put some of these perennial plants in the ground. So we've talked about the overall system as a whole: big trees, smaller trees, shrubs, ground cover, etc. We've talked about how they work together in concert. The vines crawl up the big trees, the nitrogen fixers fix nitrogen for the plants around them, the ground covers cover the ground. We've talked about what types of plants to use, and there's a lot. There's a whole body of research you could do on the wide variety of natives and naturalized and non-native, non-invasive plants that you could put in a forest garden and grow a lot of food for yourself. So I won't go into every single one of those plants, but I give you some homework and I give you some ideas of where to start with this. One last thing I would always suggest trying to plant as many natives as possible. There's a lot of really wonderful, really productive, delicious natives. You know, we're talking our black walnuts and our hickories, we're talking our blueberries, we're talking our groundnuts and sunchokes. These are plants you can and should plant. They will feed the environment around you and also feed you. I also want to encourage you to seek out named varieties of plants, or at least seeds or seedlings from named varieties. I find that these are just way more productive. I really love Peterson pawpaws. They are pawpaws that are almost 2 or 3 times as big as the wild pawpaws I've seen, and their seeds are much fewer, and so you're getting a lot more like bang for your buck. Every pawpaw you get 2 or 3 times as much flesh out of it from the same size tree as would be growing from a wild tree. We've talked about those things. Let's move on now to figuring out where in the landscape you're going to put these different things. So you want to look for a few different things, and they're very similar things to what you would look for in a veggie garden. You want to look for shade. There's this giant, beautiful oak tree here. I don't really want to put another nut tree that close to it. It's going to shade it out too much. Pay attention to where south is on your property. That's where the sun's coming from most often. And so if you have a large tree here, like your large nut tree, you might want to put some of your understory stuff to the south side of that, and even the shrubs to the south side of that even, so they get the maximum amount of sun. You want to think about water on your landscape. Even if you're not lucky enough to have a little creek running by your property, there's still areas in your landscape that probably hold more water and are more wet, and areas that are probably more dry. So do the research for the big tree, the big overstory element you want first, and figure out a good spot to put that based on sun and water, based on the soil nutrition and soil quality. And then you can start planting the trees around that. I'll give you some examples of some of the ideas and some of the elements I put on my property and the different places I put them. It's hard to see this time of the year, but I have some pawpaws in the creek bank here. I have them low, so as they grow up, I can reach straight across and pick from them. And pawpaws are plants that are okay with their roots being wet sometimes. Many other trees wouldn't really handle a flood that might come through and soak and totally saturate their roots for a day or two. Pawpaws, totally fine with that. This area gets so much sun and it's so hot for our car, so I've planted a row of apple trees here that will grow up in a couple of years, cast some shade on our very hot driveway. Dividing lines between properties is a great place to plant a hedgerow of edible plants. I have some pawpaws and some hazelnuts here. When they grow and fill out even year round, it'll be a nice barrier, it'll be a nice visual barrier between us and the neighbors. Alright, so besides planting, which is frankly most of the work when it comes to planting these perennials, because like I said, you can't move them. When they're in the ground for a long time, so it's important to know what you want and where you want it. So besides planting, what can you do this time of year? Well, you can start prepping the soil. I've made some other videos about this, but really what I've done here for the most part is just cover this grass area with 6 inches or so of wood chips, which I got from free from a local tree company. This section here was just really hard and compacted, so I came through with the broad fork to break everything up and make the soil loose and easier to plant in. By putting all of these wood chips down, I've prevented weeds from popping through. It's much harder for the weeds to take a foothold, and also as the wood chips break down, they'll start to fertilize and compost the soil and the plants around them. These perennial plants, especially natives, will not need nearly as much care as your veggie garden once they get going. But I think it's important to start with a good foot forward and prep a ground so it's full of nutrition and full of ground cover and mulch to protect these plants, especially in their first year, because their first year you really want to stay on top of watering and caring for them. After that, usually these well-established plants can go for quite some time without watering and without as much care. Friends, I'm really excited for you. Starting a forest garden can be really exciting. It's wonderful to have a 5, 10, 20-year vision of the future of plants that are small sticks now, but you know are going to be giant and productive trees. I'm excited for you to start this journey. Reach out in the comments if you have questions or if you have other ideas that I might have missed today that you would like to add to some of the stuff I've said. Have a great day, everybody.